Okay, I'm gonna continue reading The Devil in Massachusetts to chapter 18. We're almost done with this book. Chapter 18, The Ghost of Mary Etsy. In Wyndham, a town which, though close to Salem, had by God's providence largely escaped the witchcraft, lived a 17-year-old girl named Mary Herrick. On 22 September, this young woman received an uninvited guest, the shape of Mary Etsy. I'm going upon the ladder to be hanged for a witch. Goody Etsy told her, but I am innocent, and before a 12-month be past, you shall believe it. Then she vanished. The girl stared incredulously after her. She knew this witch Etsy, at least by reputation, and did not doubt at all that she and the others with her were getting on the gallows exactly what they deserved. She decided to keep her mouth shut about this incident. She would not lower herself by reporting the words of a lying witch. There was enough wild talk going on without her adding to it. She was a sensible girl, Mary Herrick, quiet without precedent in the ranks of the afflicted. But Mary Etsy, so gentle in life that the magistrates themselves were with difficulty convinced of her witchhood, and her very jailers pleaded for her, nevertheless had the will of a Cromwell. Even when she knew that there was no hope of establishing her own innocence, she had connected her contest with the judges and the hope for saving others. Now, instead of accepting future, she rose from the dead to bring her fight to the conclusion. And this was an unthought of providence, that a witch once hanged would have the power to return to haunt the living was a possibility which never entered the calculations of the judges. Were to happen, the entire legal process would be robbed of its therapeutic value, and now it happened. It was shortly after 22 September that Mary Herrick became aware of mysterious pains. At first, they had no visible cause. Then, gradually, during her affliction, a shape materialized before her, but a shape of which she could not bring herself to speak, for it was none other than that of the pious wife of John Hale of Beverly. Yet there could be no doubt that Miss Hale was a mentor. She appeared regularly, and it was her hand that pinched and choked. To be sure, after a while, she did not come unattended. Mary Etsy came too, but only to look on thoughtfully, her hands at her side. Occasionally, Mary made as if to speak and did not. At the length, it was the shape of Miss Hill who spoke. Do you think I am a witch? She asked. No, you be the devil, shouted the girl. Now Mary Etsy knew her plan had worked, for the first time she spoke, she told the girl that she had been put to death wrongfully and was innocent of the witchcraft, and she came to vindicate her cause. Then she cried, Vengeance, vengeance! Or at least that was what the girl thought she said. It seems not in character for just this ghost and give her intentions. She bid her to reveal this to Mr. Hill and Mr. Garish, and then she would raise no more, nor should Miss Hill afflict her. Mary dared not disobey. She went to her pastor, the Reverend Joseph Garish of Wyndham, and told him of what she called the delusion of the devil. The pastor, having cross-examined her and found her at least as sincerely convinced as the Salem mediums, made a business-like record of the incident, and then summoned Hale to hear from the girl's own lips this quiet, wonderful parable of the nature of delusion. Hale, however impressive his ministerial demeanor, felt the ground rock under him when he heard the story. What man would not feel so on what man would not feel so on getting evidence that his wife has committed a capital crime? Yet that was not the point. Hale knew that his wife had done nothing of the sort. She was flesh of his flesh, and had she been practicing witchcraft, he would have known it. Now knew but he now knew, and the revelation came to him with the force of a physical blow. Just so must John Proctor have felt when his own wife was cried out on, and so 100 others when wife or child or mother was taken. If his present feeling justified, why not theirs? If his present feeling was justified, why not theirs? Suddenly Hell knew with a conviction beyond logic that spectral evidence was madness. God had permitted the devil to use the shape of the innocent to delude. And this being so, how many of the innocent had been hanged in Salem? He went home to brood among his books and papers. When he had thought the thing through, he would not keep silent about his conclusions. He was a humble and courageous man. It takes courage twice to reverse one's position publicly in the matter of such moment. Mary Etsy, for her part, haunted the girl no more. Her mission was accomplished. What further need of childish spectral shows when her courage and faith that at last made their impact were winning to her own viewpoint, to her own point of view, the mind of one who had not before consciously doubted a witch's witchhood. In the meantime, a number of other people had reached the same conclusion as John Hale, if for less dramatic reasons, and were making themselves heard. Though the judges had adjourned their sitting in September with every intention of resuming them on schedule in October, so many people were now converted to Mary Etsy's opinion that they were in the wrong way. That it was a question if the court of Oyer and Terminer would be allowed to sit again. Opposition to this manner was investigating witchcraft was of course no new thing, and had begun exactly where the witchcraft had in Salem Village. An impressive number of simple country folk in and about the community had from the first faced the crisis far more realistically than had their sophisticated and learned betters in Boston and Salem town. Moreover, in spite of the fact that death or exile had usually been a penalty for coming out in opposition to the official view, an extraordinary large portion of the community had at one time or another consented to take the dangerous risk of protesting the innocent, not indeed of witches in general, but of some special witch long known and respected among them. For all the conspicuous and ruthless part of the ministry in Salem itself had played in the prosecution, ministers at large in the Bay Colony had not done any such thing. Indeed, they had done. Had they done so, the panic would never have been localized as it was, roughly to the limits of Essex County, or put in another way, within the approximate range of Miss Ann Putnam's acquaintance. Plymouth For instance, though, it must have had its own share of hysterical girls, managed to get along without cultivating any accusing circle. Andover had one, and only after deliberately exposing itself to the contagion of Salem, and as Thomas Brittle was now saying, poor Andover did now rule the day. Far more ministers were making a stand against the prosecution than were lending themselves to it. Francis Dane was now successfully rallying Andover to his viewpoint. Rallying Andover to his viewpoint. Willard of Boston had been working on the judges, three of whom were in his congregation, and though as a friend reported, he had met with little but kindness and uh, he had met with little but unkindness and abuse, and had indeed been cried out on by the accusers. He did not detest, he did not desist. Indeed, he is believed to have gone so far as to have published anonymously a dialogue between S and B in which it was suggested that the accusers were scandalous persons, liars, and loose in their conversation, and even at best disqualified as humane witnesses by the very fact of their affliction. Oh my goodness. So they didn't even count these people as being human once they were accused. Spectral evidence he renounced utterly. If the fact may be done, and yet the persons doing it be innocent of the crime, the verdict is merely uh, conjectural, said his B, uh, presumably Boston, and the man dies will by will and doom, whereas God hath not granted to man such a power over another's life, another's lives. You are an admiral advocate of witches, finally said S. Scathingly. It was a retort which Willard must have often heard. In Salem, the Quaker Thomas uh, Malday took the attitude that the whole witchcraft had been fabricated from the uh, petty hates and uh, envies. Uh, Let me start that one over. In Salem, the Quaker Thomas uh, Mole took the attitude that the whole witchcraft had been fabricated from the petty hates and envies of the community and could be destroyed if people would obey the injunction. Love your enemies, who he asked could count himself wholly guiltless. It was like the story of the woman taken in adultery. He that is wholly clear of every degree of witchcraft may cast a stone at witches. Any number of country preachers had come to the defense of accused uh, parishioners. The two ministers of Raleigh, sorry, two ministers of Raleigh, who investigated and defended Elizabeth Howe, wise of Ipswich, who had cited the eloquent example of Job in behalf of John Proctor, Miss Bradbury's pastor, the cred- credulity, sorry, it's like split up, credulity and pitiless zeal of Nicholas Noyes and Samuel Paris, far from being characteristics of the ministers of Massachusetts, seem to have been a conspicuous exception. Increase Mather himself, who had earlier been disposed to keep aloof from the witchcraft, except when his opinion was solicited, had gradually been drawn into the controversy. There is not a God in Boston, he had demanded for a parish parishioner who had carried a sick child to the accusing circle for to the accusing circle for diagnosis that you should go to the devil in Salem. On 3 October, he read before the Conference of Ministers in Cambridge a long scholarly paper called Case of Conscience, in which he set forth his mature reasoning on the nature of the evidence on which conviction could be obtained in witch trials, and his warning against placing too great reliance on spectral evidence, and his denunciation of the use of the test of touch and such superstitious devices as the making of witch cakes. He did little but repeat what he and his colleagues said before, but his language was so forceful as to suggest a new urgency of conviction. It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person should be condemned. Mather's texts contained no direct criticism of the conduct of the trials, and a preface signed by 14 ministers, among them Garish, Wise, and Willard, went no further than to hint discreetly that the dangers of over hasty suspecting or too precipitant, too uh, press precipitant judging. Mather, however, was still investigating. On 19 October, he had last acted on the petition of John Proctor. He went to Salem and made personal and revealing investigations of the conditions under which confessions were being obtained. Up until late summer, however, no one in a position of authority had come out openly against the conduct of the trials. The granite will and fierce conviction of Stoughton had set the pattern. None of his associates, not even his superior, Sir William Phipps, so had far taken issue with him, or at least taken it to any effect. I lost my place. There was an exception in Nathaniel Saltonstall, but his controversy had been carried on behind closed doors and ended with his registration, and at least so far as the general public was concerned with his silence may have an eloquence of its own, but only in the long run. Opposition can hardly rally around a man who merely withdraws and shuts his mouth. There may have been an occasional misgiving in Judge Samuel Sewall, at least so far as the accusation of his friend John Alden was concerned. He was willing to pray with the latter, but his diary punctually continued during all this period is so secret of the witchcraft. He who wrote so freely of his dreams, of his struggles to train his children, of his searchings of God's providence, wrote of the witchcraft as dryly and impersonally as if it were a subject on which he did not trust himself to have any feeling or opinions at all. Essentially, a kind of honorable man capable of generosity in recognizing and confessing a wrong. It may be that Seawall got through his inhumane duties as judge only by a kind of self hypnosis. He no less than the girls had become something of an uh, automaton. Uh, But while Sewall and the other judges clung to the party line, skepticism was making inroads among other representatives of the uh, magisterial mind. Judge Broadstreet of Andover had flatly declined to arrest any more witches. Judge Jonathan Corwin of Salem was in correspondence with an outspoken heretic of Salisbury. Corwin's whole contribution to the witchcraft had been oddly passive. Sometimes he had acted as scribe at the examinations, but he had almost never played any real part in questioning an accused. That role had usually fallen on Hawthorne, while Corwin listened and made record of his observations, possibly from the vantage he got points of view to which his more active associate was blind. If he fell a prey to misgiving, however, he was loath to give them voice, and had been otherwise, he would hardly have been asked to replace Saltonstall on the court of Oyer and Terminer, where to all appearances he obediently followed the leader. Yet, had there not been some kind of stubborn demon of doubt at work in him, it seems unlikely that he would, in August, have incurred the letter that he got from the Salisbury magistrate Richard Pike. Being of Salisbury, well removed from the storm century, Pike had at first small occasion to give close attention to the witchcraft. When, however, Saltonstall of nearby Haverhill resigned from the bench, he quite likely rode over to get some first-hand impressions, and at the same time he became involved to the extent of the accusations against Mary of Balbury and Susanna Martin. Though the latter was not of his town, he was known there, and people came to him to make formal disposition of her witcheries. Sometimes during the labors, Pike looked up at the informal dreely. I don't know why some of these words are so hard for me to say. It is a pity you didn't tell that your yeah. It is a pity you didn't tell that story 24 years ago. He remarked once when it happened to Corwin on 9 August, shortly after the trial of Burroughs. Pike wrote a letter to which he signed only uh, his initials, in which he expressed his opinion that the preset handling of the trials left the lives of innocent people to the pleasures and passions of those that are minded to take them away. The witnesses were not only informers but sole judges to the crime, and it's kind of true. I mean, it just seems like that they just like killing people. Uh, how he asked was witchcraft to be proved by reports of spectral journeys to Paris pasture, as so often by the accusing girls, by confessors, and by such erotic witnesses as Susanna Martin's accuser, John Ring. Why the devil had once carried why the devil had once carried Jesus himself from place to place in order to tempt him, and yet left him innocent by which mark. But how often might there not be found a, a super fluidity of nature as the piles? No proof was dark and uncertain. Confessors had necessitated under these circumstances that it was safer to leave a guilty person alive until further discovery than to put an innocent person to death. Who was it who told these Salem girls things that they did not see, but the devil, especially when some things that they tell are false and mistaken? Is the devil a competent witness of in such a case? And how reliable was the touch test on which the judges were setting such store? How, was it not against nature that the accused, in the very act of denying their guilt, would publicly practice witchcraft, sending their shapes to pinch and throttle, sorry, yeah, yeah, throttle in the very faces of the judges? On what grounds did the latter suppose that the devil is now become the reformer to purge witches out of the world? That the uh, reticent Corwin did not keep altogether silent about the doubts such as a police stared in him, is suggested by one expressive fact. His mother-in-law, Margaret uh, Thatcher of Boston, was accused. She was accused repeatedly. Somehow she was not arrested. One just doesn't answer to. One just doesn't swear out a warrant for a kinswoman of a judge. This was another judicial sight that did not fail to attract attention. I am sensible that it is irksome and disagreeable to go back when a man's doing is so is an implication that he has uh, been walking in the wrong path. However, nothing is more honorable than upon due conviction to retract and undo, so far as may be, what has been amiss and irregular. Yet another notable was expressing himself about the the prosecution of the witchcraft. This time it was the uh, Bostonian Thomas Brattle, a merchant somewhat as the princes of the Renaissance were wait, a merchant somewhat as the princes of the Renaissance were merchants. He was much more besides mathematician, astronomer, experienced traveler, and he was about to become treasurer of Harvard and a throne in the flesh of President Increase Mather, and shortly to help found a new church, which would be a thorn in the flesh of any Mathers at all. His recommendations came at the end of a long reasoned analysis of the course of the trials. He agreed with Pike's denunciation of spectral evidence and went beyond him. In Brittle's eyes, it was disgraceful that the magistrates had based their judgments on such evidence as common gossip, uh, irresponsible confessions, and above all, on the pretensions of the afflicted girls. These last seemed to him to be so many liars um, and mountebanks, mountebanks. Mountebanks. He heaped scorn on the mentality of what he called the Salem gentleman, carefully defining the term to exclude those Salem citizens did not participate in the prosecution and to include Boston men who did. But in Salem, this sort of gentleman does most abound. Brattle signed his full name to the document, which took the form of a letter. Began it only, "Dear Sir," addressing no one in particular. He probably intended it for a circular letter to be passed down from hand to hand, in lieu of publication. Its timing was canny. Brattle was obviously Brattle had obviously been mulling over its contents for months, but he did not risk even so discreet a publication as this until he was fairly sure of immunity from reprisal. Now, in October, his point of view was sufficiently supported in the other quarters for him to be reasonably sure that the crisis had passed its peak, as at least there was a fair chance of ex, ex I cannot say this word exercising the demonic possession of Massachusetts if enough men of goodwill had the courage to speak in the name of reason. More than protest was causing the collapse of persecution. The voices of reason had, after all, been lifted long before, but until now it had been a voice crying in the wilderness. That it was heeded at last was due to the fact that the devil had now progressed to the stage of total war. Literally, no one was safe. No degree of imminence ensured one against accusation. Recently, the girls had cried out on the spirited Lady Phipes, who, in the absence of her husband, had the daring to sign a release of one prisoner personally known to her. All very well for the judges to tell the girls that they had made a mistake, as they had done when Willard was accused, but when they had done this just so many times, the line between mistake and true accusation became obliterated. There is no way, I feel like, that these people, I mean, even if they were children, like, just there's no way that at some point in their life that this didn't come back to bite them in the ass. Indeed, the multiplication of the accusers was now bringing not only embarrassment but confession upon the judges. As Hale said, it cannot be imagined that in a place of such knowledge, so many in small compass of land should abominably leap into the devil's lap at once. In adjuring their sitting to late October, the judges had it in mind that by then Phipes would have returned and would have an opportunity to express himself on policy. The governor, who had counted on the affairs being disposed of without him, returned in October to find the colony of aroused and angry hornets' nest. Those to whom he had entrusted the task of weeding out the witches and restoring order seemed rather to have multiplied confession. Nevertheless, he could not at this stage blame them. In the report he got off to England on 11 October, describing what had been done and utterly asking counsel from the crown, he defended the judges. Indeed, in his haste, he made a copious use of a history of the witchcraft which Cotton Mather had been drafting from some documents furnished by Stephen Sewall. Mather, in spite of his professed distrust of spectral evidence, had found no fault with its actual use. And some of its credulity, I've never heard of the word credulity until I read this book, had crept over into Phipe's account. On the other hand, Phipes did not report some positive action on his part, finding that the devil had taken upon him to assume the shape of several persons were doubtless innocent to into my certain knowledge of good reputation. Lady Phipes, for one, he had forbidden further commitments. Also, he had provided the printing of discourses. Here, he may have been thinking of Brattle, that might kindle an inexcusable flame. Sorry, an inextinguishable flame. Uh, uh, Plaintively, the driven man had added that some people are seeking to turn it all on me. The uproar continued. Andover was now mobilized for an attempt to undo the results of its folly. First, on 12 October, came a petition from 7 of its citizens asking that their wives and children be released to their care unbound and describing their distress in prison. The poor, food, and cold coming on, and the unhappy company of poor distressed creatures of the as fully of inward grief and trouble as they are able to bear up in life withal. The petition was to be the forerunner of many, and not from Andover only. People in Topsfield, Gloucester, Haverhill, Chelmsford joined the plea of for the release of their kin. A second, more vigorous step was taken on 24 October when 24 Andover citizens presented a paper denouncing the accusing girls as distempered persons and protesting their position of authority in court. We know no one who can think himself safe if the accusation of children and others are under diabolical influence shall be received against persons of good fame. On 26 October, the General Court took at last decisive action. It called for a fast and convocation of ministers that be led in the right way as to the witchcraft. Sewall added dispassionately in his diary, the season and manner of doing it is such that the court of Oyer and Terminer court themselves dismissed. The court was officially dismissed 3 days later by Phipes, a Stoughton who still held to his original position as firm as a rock and had come up from Dorchester the day before to be ready for court, had wet his clothes on the storm and high tide for nothing. A postponement of the trials did not in itself solve anything. At last, 150 witches had been legally arrested and must be tried, no matter by what means. The devising of more realistic methods would take time, and meanwhile, it was a question of whether, with winter coming on all the witches, would live long enough to stand trial. The prisons of Massachusetts had not been planned with such a crime wave in mind. Most of them were shoddy structures at best, and overcrowding had produced inhuman conditions. At least 2 witches, one of them the confessing Anne Foster of Andover, had recently died there. Accordingly, Phipes now turned his attention to the petitions for release. The tender age of some of the witches must have moved him. Dorothy and Abigail uh, Faulkner, for whom Nathaniel Dane and John Osgood were willing to go a 500, I guess, pound bond when 10 and 8 respectively. Were 10 and 8 respectively. Stephen and Abigail Johnson were 13 and 11. Sarah Carrier was 8. The detention of adult witches was causing difficulty to their families. The children of Martha Sparks had become a burden on Chelmsford neighbors because while she tarried in prison, her husband Harry was a soldier in their Majesty's service at the eastern parts. The petitioners identified themselves as weavers, husbandmen, and signed with ingenious marks. The favorite in Andover was a heart. Francis Faulkner encircled his and pierced it with a broken arrow. Governor Phipps inspected the evidence against these prisoners, and when he found it to be spectral only, accepted the responsibility of releasing them on bond into the custody of their families. Such witches as most remain in jail. He made the charge of the judges that they must keep an eye on their welfare and not let them suffer want. Thus, winter began in Massachusetts, and more hopefully than had the spring. More hopefully than the spring. And yet, the spectral peril had by no means ended. People at large were not enjoying an intellectual awakening where so recently they had succumbed to the superstitious panic. Even the vote of the General Court, which led to the superstition of the court, had been closed. 33 to 29, the law enacted on 14 December hardly offered indulgence to practicing witches. It confirmed the death penalty for those who use charms to kill or hurt, for any invocation or conjuration of any evil spirit, for taking up any dead man, woman, or child out of their graves. The law did, however, differentiate between degrees of witchcraft. Only a prison sentence and the pillory were prescribed to persons who used charms to find secret treasures or stolen property, to destroy cattle, or to, in the intent to provoke any person to unlawful love. Meanwhile, even while the governor labored to release the congestion in the prisons, new prisoners came in. For neighbor still bore spite against neighbor, and the spirit of prophecy still lay on the girls whose visions had first set off this long train of events. In October, Gloucester, undeterred by the example of Andover, sent for the girls. Gloucester had reason to believe that the witches were about because during July it had fought off an invasion by devils. These swarmed out of the swamps upon the lonely garrisons and looked at first like French and Indians. Some of them wore blue shirts and had bushy black hair. But the token that By the token that bullets had no effect on them, the garrison knew that the invasion was spectral. They called for reinforcements, and in town good people cast about to identify the witches who had called the devils in. This panic had subsided before October. Nevertheless, the girls were sent for, and thanks to their ministrations, 4 women were taken. They had um, they had a melancholy time finding lodgings. Salem, to which they were taken first, had no room for them. Eventually, they wound up in Ipswich. In November, even after the superstition of the court, a Gloucester citizen summoned the girls again. By this by this time, there was a difference. It happened that on Ipswich Bridge, they met with an old woman, a veteran uh, automata that they were. They fell at once into their fits, but it was not Ipswich that had summoned them. Such Ipswich people had their belly full of such as they, for all Ipswich proposed proposed to do about it. The girls could lie on the bridge and bellow until December. Being ignored was a therapy that had rarely been tried upon these girls. Fitch, under such circumstances, left them confused. The familiar cues were lacking, although eventually they got back on their nags and rode on to Gloucester. Their performance there lacked its usual conviction and led to no arrest. Winter came on without further recorded incident so far as the witchcraft was concerned, but about Salem and Salem Village, the fields had been neglecting during the frantic uncertainties of spring and summer. There was want.